Welcome to the presentation of the hosted JavaScript. We also have a nickname called Your Page for this because this is a solution where you get to create a page on your website that you host, that your graphics artist designs and creates and completely controls. The merchants put it on their page. The consumers don't have to leave the merchant's website. We think it's an amazing solution, and it is PCI compliant and keeps your server out of scope for PCI. So we're going to talk a little bit how that works. I'm going to skip past the introduction. I've covered that in some other videos, but I'll leave that there for a minute. Now, as I mentioned, the graphics is completely under the webmaster's control. CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, whatever you want to put in there, you're certainly welcome to do so. And so it's hosted within your own environment with your own style sheets and with your own updates and release schedules, etc. So you have full control over that website. However, your host server never touches, stores, or transmits cardholder data, because when you include our JavaScript, either as a link to include it off of our server or even host it on your own, the JavaScript will replace the cardholder's data that they type into the form with a token, and then the token gets transmitted to your host server, so that you never have to touch that cardholder data, but you still get all the functionality as if you had that cardholder data and remain out of scope for PCI. Very powerful. A couple of considerations and caveats. If you're hosting this page, even though we're going to send it through secure SSL to Slim CD, you do want to have your own SSL certificate on your site just so the consumer has confidence to see that browser lock at the top. And the developer who codes the page does need to take some special consideration when creating the form so that you're not inadvertently transmitting the cardholder data back to your server, even though you don't mean to. And our samples are very clear on how to do this, and even our JavaScript that you include goes out of its way to clear those fields out in the event that the mistake was made by the developer. We still do our best to make sure that doesn't happen. But the secret to that is when you create the input fields for them to type in the card number, etc., you don't put names on the input fields, you simply put IDs that JavaScript can access, and because there's no name, the browser won't submit it as part of the name value pairs to your web server. You also create a hidden field so that our JavaScript can update it when we get the token back, and we'll replace the hidden field with a token, and that's what your server will receive. So that's a brief overview of how it works. You just need to be a little careful doing that. And there's one other big thing to consider. Because JavaScript is viewable, the person can right-click on the page and view source. You don't want to put the client ID and password in there, because that would give anyone on the web complete access to the merchant's account, and that's very bad. So instead, we recommend creating an API access credential, and there's a video on that. I encourage you to watch that. And there's two types of API access credentials, a public and a private. In this case, you'd want to create a public one, and you'd want to limit what it can do very severely to only creating tokens. And I also suggest you use temporary tokens instead of permanent tokens, because once your server receives the temporary token, it's going to process the transaction or use that token to do something else, and then the token disappears, and now you've got a new permanent token as a result of the server-to-server connectivity, and I really strongly recommend you do that. So the first thing we'd do would use a temporary token, and then you follow it with a permanent token, and we'll cover all that as well. So the hosted JavaScript implementation, as I've mentioned, the cardholder enters the data in their browser, because their browser is then connecting to Slim CD to replace it with a token. Your particular server never gets the card numbers, and therefore you're out of scope for PCI. And there is a PCI SAQ form that addresses this, so this approach has officially been accepted and validated by the PCI Council as a way to minimize and reduce scope on your website, and we really like the way this works. And again, like I say, temporary tokens are my preferred way. You can do permanent tokens as well, but I like temporary tokens for this particular implementation. So the developers portal has an amazing amount of detailed information on how to do this step by step, and we're going to go over that. Here's the URL. You can also see it on the main page, and I'm going to access it through the main page so you can do that as well. So again, I've talked about the special care that must be taken with the card number fields. You also must do some special stuff with the on submit event when the submit button is clicked, so that lets our script do its work and replace things. And once your server gets the token back, then you can look at our direct API connection and see how you can use any of your back-end languages to actually process the tokens. And there's some samples on these pages too that I'll show you on how other people have done it. So let's just do that. Let's get right into the coding. Under Investigate, this is so straightforward. We actually put it all in one page. So your page with JavaScript. It explains what it is, explains how it works. It goes over the details that I mentioned, that you place an ID on each input field that has the PCI sensitive data, the card number, expiration date, CVV2, but you do not give it a name. So here its input type is text and it has an ID, but there's no name equals. Because there's no name, the browsers will not submit this data to your server. Very important not to put a name on it. The second thing, you want to have an onSubmit on your form, and in this case we're going to call it submit handler. So the onSubmit is going to call the function that we create, that you will create and modify, that checks the input validity, etc., etc. So the key things to know is on your fields that are sensitive, that you don't want going to your server, do not put names on them, but put IDs. The second thing is to create an onSubmit handler for the form. So when they click submit, you get what you need. And the third thing is that you want to return false to stop the form tag from submitting the form, so that our JavaScript code, the one we're going to write together that runs on your page, will be able to modify the hidden fields and submit that to you. So you'll get just the data you want. So the data that you want will be placed as hidden fields somewhere in your form. You'll want the gate ID, and that's the token, or a temporary token if you're using temporary tokens. You want the last 4 digits of the card and the card type. So while this uses the gate ID, which is a permanent token, again, I recommend temporary tokens. And once you get an approval from calling our JavaScript function, that's when you blank out these card numbers just to be safe. You don't have to do it, but let's just make sure. And you, from our reply that's already parsed for you, you simply get the card type and the last 4, and you put those into the hidden fields you just created here. Then you actually submit the form manually yourself, which will cause the rest of the fields to go to your server. So same thing can be done in jQuery, but just make sure you enable cores, etc. And again, read this document to give you a lot of the hints there. So here's the process transaction call that processes it. I've used an API access credential, and I'm calling the trans type of load. So I'm calling process transaction to create a permanent token with a load. Don't need an amount, but here's the data I'm collecting off the form. And I'm also happening to put in some other information because I happen to have it. But really, this is the key to what we need to have. The card number, expiration date, amount of 0, and trans type of load if we're creating that permanent token. So here's some more explanation of how all this works and what to do and when to do it. And now let's put the whole thing together. So when we put the whole thing together, we're going to validate the user input, make sure it's a valid card number, make sure it's a valid expiration month and year, and we're going to disable the submit button so they can't click it twice. We're going to call this process transaction to return the permanent token, and its callback will do the replacement that we talked about. We're going to get the gate ID and set it in. We're going to wipe out the card numbers. We're going to set these other data fields that you might want passed back to you. You can also, if you want, pass back expiration month and year. You're allowed to have those as well. And if it's declined for any reason, this just shows an alert, but you could show a message box on your form as well. And it always returns false, so the form doesn't submit. The reason why the form doesn't submit, because we're going to submit it manually upon success here. So here's our actual HTML. Here's the hidden fields that I talked about. In this case, I've actually got a little debugging URL in there. You'll probably want to take that out and put your server's action in there where you want the data to go, maybe a PHP page or even JavaScript, whatever you want to do there. And some extra fields on the form, whatever fields you want, under your control. Here's the expiration month and year that we need, card number, again, IDs with no names. And this is a nice little trick. If you put this hidden field or this input field on your form somewhere, you could actually see if debug is on in the JavaScript. It'll show you the full URL that our process transaction is invoking, which lets you do a little debugging to make sure everything's being posted to us correctly, and of course you take that off in production. Now here are two samples. One uses Windows Azure with this technique, and here is another one on GitHub where the person uses the load like we've done here to create a permanent token, but he also uses QData, which is get temporary token is the function called the entry point. So get temporary token will actually return to you a temporary token that expires. And I suggest instead of calling process transaction here, you get back a temporary token, but the choice is certainly yours on which way you want to go about that. The only downside of using load is if someone uses this page nefariously, they'll just put a bunch of card numbers in your database that you don't really want there. If it's temporary token, if somebody puts in all the card numbers they want and they don't consume them, they'll disappear on their own in 5 minutes, and it won't actually tell them anything. They won't get any real value out of doing it, so they'll leave your site alone to run stolen cards or whatever. So a little bit of caution about it's anonymous facing out to the real world, so you do have to watch out for the bad actors in the world. So the API access credential that I talked about is really important, and here's an example of one. The reason why you want to do that is, again, this is viewable by the general public, so you don't want to put a true username and password in there. By creating an API access credential, you can limit what it can do so that it can cause you no harm and no foul. You don't need a password with an API access credential. The other great value here is that if someone changes the password on the regular username and password, it doesn't affect the API access credential, so your remotely distributed systems such as websites and things like that continue to operate, and they don't come down because a manager got fired and so the owner changed the password and now all the website comes down. You don't have that problem when you use API access credentials. Strongly encourage you need to use them for sure in the public facing JavaScript solution, but I strongly encourage them to use them in all, even your backend host PHP or whatever you want to do to connect server to server, use it in those solutions as well. So the developer's website, I brought that up before, but we'll do it again. Developer's website is here, and I'll go back up to the home. If I come home on it, under investigate, you'll find your page technology here with everything on one page that you need. Then under the reference library, you can also find, here's your get temporary token call if you want to use those instead. You'll notice that it returns in its data block the temporary token instead, and you'll want to save that and pass that instead of the gate ID. And then when you call process transaction, you either pass it the gate ID or the temporary token, whichever one you've acquired. And here's a JavaScript example of how to do it. So all that information is here on the Slim City website, including if you're going to consume the temporary or the permanent token with process transaction from your PHP code or .NET code, whatever you're choosing to use. There's samples of how to do that. And instead of using a card number and expiration month, expiration year here, you would either put in request.gate ID or request arrow gate ID or request arrow temporary token, whatever you acquired, from your server to our server to actually consume those tokens and charge the cards. So pretty simple and straightforward. Sample codes from outside developers, from inside developers. It's all there for you. And we even have on our download page, under JavaScript, we do have some samples of the Your Page technology where it will run and create a temporary token, etc. Or I think this creates a permanent token, but again, you've got your choices here on how you want to do this, all this stuff. Of course, as I mentioned, you can view the source, you can actually look at how it works, see the code in play, modify it how you'd like, and it's yours for the complete control, as I mentioned, and that's the value of having the hosted JavaScript solution in your own applications. I mentioned all our entry points already and the libraries that support them all. Certainly very valuable for the server-to-server communication stuff, and the downloads page we've already been to. Here's those URLs again for your convenience. Make sure you use them. Take advantage of what we built for you already. And I certainly appreciate your time in watching this video. Let us know if you have any questions or how we can help.